Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to part 2 of my essay video series on Godzilla 2014. Back in part 1, we talked about the human side of the film's story as well as the thematic core of the film as a whole. So now, let's talk about the other side of the story. The more monstrous side, if I may call it, with the characters that fall into that category consisting of Godzilla and his rivals, the Mutos. No sense in beating around the bush for this one. Let's get right into these clashing titans, shall we? The first monster character whom we're going to talk about here is our title character, Godzilla, obviously. Godzilla, as we are shown and told of him in this film, which remains consistent in the MonsterVerse entries that are to come, is an apex predator that has existed for a long, unknown period of time, who was thought to have been destroyed by the use of a hydrogen bomb that after he was spotted and tracked in the Pacific Ocean back in 1954. Wink wink. As stated by Dr. Serizawa and Dr. Graham, Godzilla, as well as the Mutos, come from a period when the Earth's surface was much more radioactive than it is to this day, and ended up moving to further underground in a search for radiation to find sustenance. When the male Muto literally sprouts wings and as its female counterpart is on the verge of rising up as well, Godzilla reemerges from hibernation in order to stop their union and to prevent the natural order from going out of whack. Despite being of a more ancient age, Godzilla is shown to be as determined as can be to be very powerful, and to know how to end a fight when the opportunity arises, such as when he seizes the opportunity to swat his tail at the male Muto in order to smash him to death into a building, and when he finishes off the female Muto while she is distracted by Ford. While Godzilla is shown to be strong in will and rather fierce when engaged in combat, he is not invulnerable, for he alone must hold the weight of the world on his scaly shoulders. Keeping the peace and the natural order is a burden which he must bear, and it is shown to take a toll on him, such as in the scene where Ford sees an exhausted Godzilla struggling to catch his breath as the Titan looks back at him. Moments like this allow for the audience to feel for Godzilla, which makes his victory over the Mutos, as well as his reawakening and returning to the sea right at the very end of the film, all the more triumphant. The 2014 portrayal of Godzilla is excellently realized, and every minute he's on screen is never wasted, as he is given a strong character that represents nature's efforts to rebalance itself that mankind must allow in order to ensure a brighter future in the world. That, and there are great satisfying highlights throughout the movie involving Godzilla when he himself is in action. So we've gone over the Big G, whom the film is named after, obviously. Now let's talk about his opponents. The Mutos, who aren't given a proper name aside from the designation abbreviated from massive unidentified terrestrial organisms, are a pair of insectoid creatures from the same prehistoric period as Godzilla that are discovered by Monarch after a strip mining accident in the Philippines. They both go on to cocoon themselves and feed off of various sources of radiation, one in Janjira and one in Nevada, until they each rise up in order to try to meet each other after years of talking. The Mutos are mates for life, basically, one male and one female. They intend to use their echolocation to converge their paths towards each other so that they can lay a whole bunch of eggs and start a family, which unfortunately would mean the end of mankind and the world as we know it. However, they both are thwarted by Godzilla, who was keeping tabs on their talking the whole time, as well as Ford Brody, who goes on to blow up their nest during the final battle. The male Muto, known by the Godzilla fanbase as Hawk Muto, is smaller, has wings that enable it to fly, has a special ability that allows it to let out concentrated blasts of energy that are akin to an EMP burst, and is more often shown as Godzilla's rival in combat. He is also shown to be more agile due to his smaller size, making him a formidable foe for Godzilla. The female, referred to as Femmuto, is larger, has an extra set of legs, and is responsible for caring for and laying the eggs of her offspring. Despite being closer to Godzilla's size, Femmuto is shown to be weaker, and is only able to gain the upper hand when she and Hawkmuto are working together. She also produces a field of energy around her similar to her mate's EMP bursts that causes anything electronic to short circuit and become inoperable within a certain radius. resulting in disasters such as airliners crashing down. Despite being the villains of the film, there is a sense of tragedy in the circumstances of the Mutos rising. They're animals that found themselves awakening in a world that is unlike what their species once predominantly existed in, making their union and consummation not feasible without upsetting the world's natural order. When Ford destroys the nest, the Mutos, particularly Femmuto, show a strong display of remorse, gaining them some level of sympathy considering that they were just fighting to survive and procreate like any animal would, even if by procreating they would overrun the planet and cause the natural order to be unbalanced. The Mutos serve as credible and formidable antagonists that bolster the film's thematic premise of what man's tampering with nature and failure to take heed of the consequences could bring about. They are also portrayed rather realistically considering their animalistic behavior, such as when Femmuto curiously inspects where Ford and Morales are hiding from it on a bridge, and considering how protective they are of each other and especially of their offspring. Now, I want to discuss a particular critique towards Godzilla 2014 that's been pretty common amongst various circles, and that critique pertains to the monster's screen time, more specifically Godzilla's. Considering that I foreshadowed this back at the beginning of part 1, might as well jump right into it. Godzilla himself doesn't show up in the film quite a lot, while the Mutos are featured a bit more prominently. This is something which other entries in the MonsterVerse have accounted for by giving their title monsters more screen time, which admittedly I do very much appreciate. That being said, while I understand why someone may personally feel disappointed by not seeing much Godzilla in a film titled Godzilla, saying that Godzilla is featured sparingly isn't a strong enough criticism considering how he was used alongside the Mutos. There are several Godzilla films in the past, particularly from the Showa era, where Godzilla not only doesn't appear much, but only appears in response to something else. Whether it's wrongdoings committed by mankind, intentionally or otherwise, like in Godzilla 1954 with nuclear tests in the Pacific, and GMK with the atrocities Japan committed during the Pacific conflict being generally forgotten/ignored, or another monster including Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and Terror Mechagodzilla, where Godzilla steps in to combat against something worse. And then you have something like Invasion of Astro Monster, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, where Godzilla is literally plucked off the earth and eventually used as a weapon by the Godzillians via mind control to destroy the world. In Godzilla 2014, the Big G becomes a key player as a result of the Mutos being accidentally discovered and awakened by strip mining, which resulted in Hawkmuto hatching from a spore to begin his feeding/metamorphosis in Janjira, and Femmuto to be taken back to America where, unbeknownst to the US government, she would feed on nuclear material in a top-secret facility. The film does a good job at staying in line with what Godzilla films in the past had done by giving solid justification for Godzilla to only be reactive and only making his grand entrance near the halfway mark by establishing him as only stepping in to keep the natural order in check by quelling a potential threat to its balance. The film also approaches Godzilla's screen presence in a similar way as Steven Spielberg's 1975 classic, Jaws, where even when the monsters aren't on screen and even when we focus on the human element much more prominently throughout, the monsters' presence, particularly Godzilla's, are felt, keeping the audience on their toes for when the monsters show up. Much like the shark from Jaws, where the screen time is restrained, but all the scenes when they do appear really leave an impact and are never wasted. Even the scene where Sam Brody watches Godzilla's fight with Hawkmuto on TV, which is the only glimpse that we get of their first encounter in Hawaii, long enough for his mother Elle to see it as well, is a good way to convey the stakes being raised as the existence of giant monsters, which were initially kept secret, has been revealed to the global public, thus kicking off the second half of the film, which consists of the US military trying to nuke the monsters. Now, it's perfectly fine to still feel like Godzilla could have used more screen time. There's nothing wrong with wanting more of a good thing. Heck, I too would be interested in seeing an alternate version of this film where we get to see Godzilla's fight with Hawkmuto in Hawaii in full before cutting away to Sam and Elle seeing the news report of it. It may even be a bit better in practice for all we know. But as the film that we do have here stands, Godzilla's screen time and presence is sufficient given the story that is being told here. Godzilla 2014 also gives us some rather neat bits of world building, even if it is fairly minimal, allowing the film to stand on its own. The opening credits alone give us an idea of how myths and legends of great and terrible beasts were inspired by beings like Godzilla. This bit of world building would go on to be further explored later down the line in the Monsterverse. Through Serizawa and Graham's meeting with Ford, the film also hints at a bigger world and history without getting completely indulgent on it or baiting sequels/spin-offs, such as Monarch having spent decades studying and understanding monsters like Godzilla that have been around for many, many years. So, as a movie on its own, Godzilla 2014 doesn't dive too deeply into world building, considering Gareth Edwards' intent to tell a story that may be deemed as a one and done depending on its box office and critical reception, but there is still just enough world building written in to suffice for this particular entry and to raise intrigue for further exploration in future movies. So this brings part 2 of my essay video series on Godzilla 2014 to a close. Stay tuned for part 3, where I will discuss the film's technical aspects, primarily the quality of its visual work and the execution of its big set pieces. Part 3 will also serve as the conclusion of this series, where I will provide a final assessment on the film's overall quality. But until then, thanks for watching, and I will see you all later.